So today, as you know, we welcome Peter Lipton, who will be very well known to us. Many of us who are here, of course, is head of the History and Philosophy of Science Department, prolific writer and lecturer, and we're looking forward to his forthcoming book, The Human Predicament. I think, is that coming up? The Human Predicament. Well, there you go.
Immodest, but not that immodest.
That's your next book. The Human, okay. I think they sound like the same thing, actually, but maybe we can be very similar. But today, Peter's going to speak to us on science, religion, belief, or commitment. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you. Reminds me of a passage in one of my favorite books, which is Nelson Goodman's Fact, Fiction, and Forecast, where what he actually wrote is something like, we must distinguish between causal and casual connections. And I read that sentence about 10 times because I couldn't see the difference between the two words. Well, Dennis, thank you very much for inviting me and for introducing me, and thank you all for coming along. I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to talk about different ways one could manage cognitive tensions between science and religion. And my main purpose is to give you a menu. It's to give you options. I am going to plug slightly one item on the menu, but not very hard, because I want to suggest that there may be rather more options than people standardly acknowledge. Now, before I get into this, I want to come clean and say that my perspective on this issue, relationship between science and religion, is not the view from nowhere. I have a particular perspective, and this is a problem that has a personal as well as an intellectual resonance for me. I mean, it's strange in a way that when it comes to the problem of the existence of the external world, I don't take that too personally. But when it comes to science and religion, that is more significant for me. And I think it may well be the case that my particular background has affected my take on this issue. So you better know up front that I am a progressive Jew. I am active in the progressive Jewish community here in Cambridge. And I'm very interested in science as well. And my perspective on science is broadly realist. That is, strangely enough, I do think that science is attempting to acquire the view from nowhere. So now you know. What I want to focus on are the different ways we can manage contradictions. So what do we do when we are faced with contradictions? I mean, it's not that we don't have contradictory beliefs. Of course we do. So here's a personal example that'll show you that I have no pride whatsoever. I used to teach in northwestern Massachusetts in Williamstown, very beautiful village, and I was in walking distance from my office. And I used to always take one path from my house to my office and take a different path from my office back to home, convinced in each case that I was taking the shortest route. But of course I also believed that the length of a route is not affected by the direction you move along it. So my beliefs were inconsistent. But I happily held those inconsistent beliefs because I wasn't aware of the contradiction, however blatant it really was. So that's one way we handle contradictions. We just have contradictory beliefs. But once you are aware that the beliefs are contradictory, then it looks like you've got to do something about it. So what are your options then? Well, of course, the most common option is to more or less ignore it. You just hope it'll go away. You don't worry about it. You don't put the two beliefs together too much. You know, in some contexts you focus on the one, in some contexts you focus on the other. There are various cognitive strategies for compartmentalizing the two halves of the contradiction so the contradiction doesn't do too much damage. But what if you want to face up to it with more intellectual honesty and get rid of that incoherence? Well, what I want to suggest is that there are two different, very broad strategies you have. And I want to develop the contrast between these two strategies. And it's the contrast between adjusting the content of the statements in question and adjusting one's attitude towards the statements in question. So it's changing content versus changing attitude. In the case of changing content, when you're faced with a contradiction, what you do is you give up one of the claims, or you give them both up, so that the set of claims that you are left with is consistent. That's the obvious thing to do when you're faced with a contradiction. Give something up. But it's not the only thing you can do, and I want to contrast that obvious strategy of reducing content to eliminate contradictory content with another strategy where you keep the contradictory content, but you change your attitude towards those statements. In particular, you no longer simply believe both of the contradictory statements. So that although you are in some sense retaining the statements, so the set of statements remains contradictory, you can restore consistency to your set of beliefs. So your beliefs are consistent, even though there's a sense in which you have not eliminated the contradiction. This will all become much more straightforward, I think, as I flesh it out in the context of science and religion. Okay, so let's see how this plays out in the case of science and religion. I'm going to take it that there are contradictions between the claims of science and religion. If by religion you mean literal interpretation of what various religious texts say. So I can choose your favorite example. The story of Genesis in the Bible construed literally, as opposed to what the best science tells us about where the earth and everything else came from. Miracles, as religious texts describe them, and many other things as well. So I'm taking it that there are contradictions there between the statements from the two areas, the statements in a religious text and the statements in our best science. So, what are our options for handling those contradictions? Well, before I begin to give you the menu, I just want to make two caveats so I can sleep with myself. The first is that although, as you see, I am focusing very particularly on a tension issue between science and religion, I'd be very disappointed if, as someone coming from a history and philosophy of science operation, I left you with the impression that the history of the relationship between science and religion is a history of tension, a history of contradiction, a history of war. Because I think that is very far from the case, but it's a very common stereotype. So that's my first caveat. I don't want you to think that I think that. If you look at the history of science and the history of religion, first of all, the issue of tension between science and religion is much more complicated than it seems at first. Because the way the problem is typically posed, one has a natural tendency to take our current conceptions of science and our current conceptions of religion and to project them back on the history of science and the history of religion. And that in many cases has a very strong distorting influence because the category science and the category religion has not been static, unsurprisingly, has not been static over human development. So what counted as what we think of now as science, hundreds of years ago, it was a different sort of activity than science today. And I think also on the religious side, the conception of what it is to belong to a religion, what it is to be religious, has changed very dramatically. So the whole way the thing is set up is perhaps problematic. But even waiving that, if you look at the history of the relationship between science and religion, what you see again and again is mutual support between science and religion. So to just take obvious sorts of case, you have scientists, or what the precursors of scientists, looking to religion as a way of underwriting scientific methods. So scientists have been very concerned about the enormous projections that they make from their evidence to their claims about the world. And they're looking for some sort of assurance that their methods are going to be reliable. And they very often look to religion for that kind of support. Similarly, from the religious side, in the history of religion, it's been very common to look to science for support. For example, to see science as the most powerful vehicle for illuminating the nature of God. Because the nature of God is to be revealed in nature, and the way we find out about nature is through science. So I just don't want you to think that I think that all there is to science and religion is tension. But that is the problem I'm going to focus on today. The second caveat I want to make is that I am focusing on a highly narrow cognitive issue, the question of contradictions between statements, statements from science and statements from religion. But again, I'd be very disappointed if that way of posing my question today led you to think that I equated religion with religious statements. And I think that's also a very common distorting way of framing the issue in discussions of science and religion. And maybe I don't need to say this to most of you here, but it's just an incredibly impoverished view of religion to equate religion with a religious dogma. Right? Religion is a form of life, and it's got an awful lot going on to it, quite apart from particular statements that might form part of a religious creed. So I want to acknowledge that as well. All right, but now that I have given you these caveats, and so I will be able to sleep with myself tonight, I want to go on with the contradiction problem. So what are some of the ways one can deal with what one takes to be contradictions between claims of science and claims of religion? Well, here I'm going to be very brief with some of these. One obvious maneuver is to say that the claims on at least one side are not to be understood literally. They are, for example, metaphorical. So if you construe the religious text, say the text of Genesis, as metaphorical, then you can eliminate the contradiction between what Genesis says about the development of the world and what science says about the development of the world. Because you take the Genesis narrative to be metaphorical, and there's no actual contradiction any longer. So that's an obvious example of eliminating a contradiction by changing the content. You change what the text is saying by switching from a literal construal to a metaphorical construal. I myself do not favor that solution to the problem, because I think that changing the content in that way impoverishes the religious text. It's not that I don't think that there's metaphor in the Pentateuch, for example. It seems to me obvious that there is metaphor there. When it says in Exodus that God brought the Israelites out of Egypt with a mighty and outstretched arm, I think that is pretty clearly metaphorical. I don't think that the text is actually saying that there was a big arm there that did the heavy lifting. Right? So it's not that there's no metaphor, but I think when in Exodus it says that God caused the Red Sea to part, what that actually is saying is that God caused the Red Sea to part. I think that text is intended literally. And I think if you say, oh, it's all, wherever it contradicts science, it all should be understood metaphorically, I think that impoverishes the religious text. So that very briefly is why I don't like the metaphor solution to the contradiction problem. But that's only the first option. Second option is to say, look, there can really be no contradiction between religious claims and scientific claims, because the claims are in different realms. Scientific claims are factual claims, whereas religious claims are normative or value claims. And there is a gap, a logical space between fact and value. For a surprisingly pure version of that view, you can see, for example, Stephen Jay Gould's little book, Rock of Ages. That's exactly the line that he takes. I don't like this solution either. I don't like this solution for a couple of reasons. One is that I am not so confident about this cordon sanitaire between fact and value. I'm not sure that the distinction is nearly as crisp as this solution would suggest. Nor do I think that science is a value-free zone. But for me, most important of all, nor do I think that religion is a fact-free zone, in the sense that it seems to me once again that the religious texts are making factual claims, in addition to ethical claims. A plain reading of those texts suggests that they are making, for example, historical claims. So I don't think that solution does justice to the religious texts either. Third option is, I really shouldn't use this expression because it kind of prejudges it, pick and mix. So in this view, what we do is we isolate the contradictions between scientific claims and religious claims, and we restore consistency in each case. This is again to adjust content by sometimes giving up the religious claim. We say, oh well, science has shown that that's wrong. But in other cases, perhaps giving up the scientific claim and saying, no, in this case, on balance, we ought to stick with the religious claim and not believe what the science tells us. If you want a good example of a philosopher who I believe takes that view, Alvin Plantinga, very powerful philosopher of religion who takes that pick and mix approach. Again, I don't find it attractive because I think it corrupts both the scientific tradition and the religious tradition to remove those bits and pieces in order to restore consistency. But what I want to suggest in the rest of this talk is that those three options, the three strategies for getting rid of contradiction, appeal to metaphor, or putting all the fact on one side and all the value on the other, or pick and mix, I don't think those are the only options we have. And I think you can see some of the further options by focusing on actually something I know something about, unlike most of this talk, which are some of the options in the philosophy of science for different ways of understanding scientific theories. I think once you realize the number of different ways we can understand what science is doing, that will give us more options. And moreover, some of those options for construing science, I think, have analogs for options of different ways of construing religious discourse, and that will further multiply the options available to us. And I want to focus on a couple of those options that I think come if you try and apply certain views of science to religion. And I think both of these approaches are approaches that avoid eliminating content, but instead would have us adjust our attitude towards that content. Now let me give you an example, not of the position I'm going to develop, but something analogous that I think is very striking from the great 17th century French philosopher Descartes. So here's a quote from Descartes. And this is meant to illustrate how you can preserve the content both of science and religion, even where there are contradictions, by adjusting attitude. And it's a particularly blatant version of this. Here's the quote. There is no doubt that the world was created with all of its perfection from the very beginning. This is what the Christian religion teaches us, and natural reason likewise convinces us of the same. For once we take account of the omnipotence of God, we must conclude that whatever he created would have had its entire perfection from the beginning. Nevertheless, to understand the nature of plants or of man, it is much better to consider how they can gradually develop from seeds than to consider how they were created by God at the beginning of the universe. Thus, if we can think of a few very simple and easily known principles from which we can show that the stars and the earth and everything else we can observe on the earth could have developed as if from seeds, although we know that they did not in fact develop that way, we could explain their nature much better in this way than if we simply describe them as they are now, or how we believe they were created. I think it's a very striking passage. What Descartes, if you take him literally, what Descartes is saying is, look, there is a contradiction between the scientific story of how things have developed, how things have come to have the properties they now have, and the religious story. But we should not eliminate either of those stories. Rather, we should keep them both, contradictory though they are, but not believe them both. So we preserve the content, but we adjust our attitude. So we adopt a belief attitude towards the religious story, but we adopt a somehow different attitude towards the scientific story. We don't believe that it is literally true, though we do construe it literally, because by construing it literally and working out how these organisms and entities could have developed as if from seeds, we will come to a better understanding of their nature. So that's, I think, a particularly vivid example of how one could hold on to the contradictory claims and yet restore consistency in one's belief by not adjusting content, but rather by adjusting one's attitude towards that content, not believing all of the content one nonetheless uses. Parenthetically, I'll just say in a sentence or two, I think many people, when they hear this quotation, will think that this is just Descartes being careful. That in fact, he doesn't believe the religious stuff at all. He believes the scientific story, but he's afraid he'll get into trouble if he says that. And I'll just say that I'm not at all convinced that that is the case. I think it's not like Hume, the Humean predicament. Descartes' situation, his whole philosophy requires him to take religion very seriously. God is a linchpin in Descartes' philosophy. Okay, so let me give you these two possibilities, and they are both inspired by particular views in the philosophy of science, though I'm going to moot the possibility of applying these approaches to the philosophy of religion. So the first one is what I call in the handout the many worlds solution. And this is inspired by the enormously influential and I think important work of Thomas Kuhn, clearly one of the greatest figures in 20th century science studies, and an exceptional figure for, among other reasons, because of the way he speaks, I think, with equal power to historians of science and to philosophers of science. So what did Kuhn, let me tell you what Kuhn said in 90 seconds. You can do it this way. One of the most notorious sentences in Kuhn's wonderful book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, goes something like this. After a scientific revolution, the world changes. After a scientific revolution, the world changes. What could Kuhn possibly mean by that? Well, here's possibility number one. When he says, after a scientific revolution, the world changes, what he means is, after a scientific revolution, people's beliefs about the world change. But that is too obviously correct to possibly be what he said, right? That is boring. Obviously, after a scientific revolution, people's beliefs about the world change. But that is not what that does not do justice to Kuhn's dramatic claim. So that is too cold, that interpretation. Well, here's another option. Maybe when Kuhn says after a scientific revolution the world changes, he means that after a scientific revolution, the stuff out there, the stars, completely independent of us, they somehow change. Well, that is dramatic enough for something a philosopher might say, crazy enough for something a philosopher might say, but it is absurd. I mean, that is a crazy interpretation. So that is too hot. So I want to eliminate those two possibilities. He doesn't simply mean that the beliefs change, and he can't mean that the world out there independently of us changes. That is too spooky. But then what could he possibly mean? Well, here's what I think he meant. Kuhn's view was that the world that science studies is not a world that is wholly independent from the scientists. And what he has in mind here, the dependence he has in mind, is not a causal dependence. It's not that we influence bits of the world through our experiments, or that the world influences us, though obviously that takes place. It is a kind of conceptual influence. Kuhn took the view that in order to study the physical world, to some extent, we as scientists have to project some structure onto that world to make it a possible object of investigation. So the world that we study is a kind of joint product of the things in itself, the stars as they are completely independently of us, though even to call them stars is already to classify them. It is a joint product of the things in themselves and the organizing activity of the scientist, in particular, the taxonomic activity of the scientist, the categories that the scientist uses to try and understand the world. Now, for those of you who know something about the history of philosophy, this should sound very familiar. because this is Kant's view about our knowledge of the world. Kant held that it is impossible for us to know about what he referred to as the noumena, the things in themselves, but that the only world we can know about is what he called the phenomenal world, the world of appearance, which is a joint product of the things in themselves and the organizing features of the mind. I think that's Kuhn's view, or at least it was at one stage in his development as well. So, when Kuhn says, well, I've drawn the parallel now between Kuhn and Kant, but let me mark the obvious difference between Kuhn and Kant. That's easy. The difference between Kuhn and Kant is that Kuhn is Kant on wheels. So, Kant held that the world we study is a joint product. It involves the things in themselves plus the human contribution. But Kant also held that the form of the human contribution was fixed. There's only one kind of contribution that we can make that makes it even possible for us to experience objects as outside ourselves. Kuhn agrees with Kant that you can only investigate a world by bringing something to the party yourself, by imposing your own scheme. But unlike Kant, Kuhn argued that that human contribution is variable. And that's precisely what a scientific revolution is. It's a case where the human element of the world that science studies changes radically. The human contribution changes. But since the phenomenal world is a composite of the things in themselves and the human contribution, and the human contribution changes across a scientific revolution, after a scientific revolution, the world changes. It's not simply that beliefs about the world changes. It's certainly not that the things in themselves change. But the phenomenal world changes because that world is partially constituted by us and our contribution has fundamentally changed. That's it. That's Kuhn. I mean, I've left out in a way the most interesting stuff about Kuhn with exemplars, but it's not to the present point. That's Kuhn's metaphysics and his epistemology. How might one apply this idea to science and religion? Well, you might say, we resolve the tension between science and religion by saying that both science and religion are describing worlds, but they are not describing the same world. Because the only worlds we can describe are phenomenal worlds. Those worlds are partially constituted by us. And in science and religion, we provide a radically different contribution to the discourse and to the worlds that that discourse describes. So you would eliminate the contradiction between scientific claims and religious claims by multiplying worlds. You would say that what you really have are two parallel universes, the world of science and the world of religion. That doesn't mean they don't have anything to do with each other, any more than Kuhn claimed that during a scientific revolution, the old tradition and the new tradition have nothing to do with each other. But it would mean that there is a strong sense in which they are separate worlds, and so they cannot contradict each other because they are separate from each other. So there is a sense in which that maneuver would preserve content. You would preserve a literal interpretation of the scientific claims and a literal interpretation of the religious claims. But you would eliminate contradictory beliefs by taking an attitude towards those claims, namely the attitude that the kind of thing that those claims are describing is not a noumenal world, it's not things as they are in themselves, but rather two phenomenal worlds. And this is quite a step from Kuhn, because Kuhn talks about scientific revolutions where there's competition between the old tradition and the new tradition, and I'm suggesting something where one wouldn't have competition. But it's an example of how material from the philosophy of science, an unobvious interpretation of scientific discourse, might give you additional options for conceiving the relationship between science and religion. That's the first one. Now let me give you the other one. The other one is inspired by another philosopher of science who is still alive and very active at Princeton, and that is the philosopher Bas van Fraassen, originally Dutch but American. von Frossen has developed a position that he calls constructive empiricism. And it is a version of instrumentalism. Instrumentalism is a view about science that sees the function of science not as primarily revelatory of an invisible world, not primarily as this descriptive of unobservable events and processes, but rather sees scientific theories, or the fundamental function of scientific theories, as providing powerful computers for making predictions about what you will observe under various circumstances. So, I mean, maybe a contrast would be good. The realist, the kind of philosopher of science that I would like to be, is someone who says what a theory is trying to do is it's trying to give an accurate representation of the world as it is in itself, including in its unobservable aspect. So, on that view, theories are fundamentally maps of reality. They are representations of reality. For an instrumentalist, theories are not fundamentally representations, they are fundamentally tools. That's why it's called instrumentalism. They are fundamentally computers. You don't ask, is the theory true? You ask, does it get us good predictions? Okay. So von Frossen is an instrumentalist, but he is a particular sort of instrumentalist, and a very interesting sort of instrumentalist from the point of view of my current project. So let me tell you in 90 seconds what his position is. His position has three components to it, and I've put those on the handout under immersion solution. Literal semantics, immersion, acceptance. Literal semantics means that von Frossen interprets scientific theories literally. So when a theory appears to be describing unobservable entities, like subatomic particles, von Frossen takes the theory straight. He takes it to be the theory to be making claims about unobservable particles. So he agrees with the realist at the semantic level. He gives a literal interpretation. The second component of von Frossen's philosophy is immersion. And that is the idea that when scientists are using their theories, they immerse themselves into in that theoretical world, in the world, say, of subatomic particles. They enter imaginatively into the universe of that theory, and they do their science from within. But doing that, for von Frossen, and this is quite important to his position, and some of his critics take him to task over this, doing that, immersion, is not the same as belief. It is a kind of imaginative activity that makes for good science, but it does not require that you actually believe that these claims are true. I mean, one analogy that may be helpful, perhaps for those of you who are scientists, is you'll be familiar with the fact that in science we use models all the time, and that quite often it seems that scientists use different models that are not really compatible with each other. So you might, for some purposes, treat a fluid as made up of discrete particles, whereas for other purposes you treat the fluid as a continuous medium. Those are incompatible models, but it's no problem. One model works better for some phenomena, the other model works better for other phenomena. When you're using one of those models, you may immerse yourself into maybe fluid is a bad example here. You immerse yourself into the world of that model, but that doesn't mean you believe that literally it's a continuous medium, say. You realize it's made of particles. So immersion is important, but it is not the same as belief. And that distinction is crucial because of the third and final component of von Frossen's philosophy. And that is his notion of acceptance. That's his word for it. It's not a brilliant word because it's too common a word. He's using the word in a technical sense. He wants to distinguish two different cognitive attitudes you can take towards a scientific theory. And those are the attitudes of believing the theory is true and accepting that the theory is empirically adequate. So what is that? To accept a theory is to believe that part of it is true, but to be agnostic about the rest. To accept a theory is to believe that all the claims it makes about observable states of affairs are true, But it is not to commit yourself to the story it tells about the unobservable mechanisms behind all that. That's why I'm calling it partial belief. It's to believe some of the logical content of the theory, but not all of it. And von Frassen's view is that scientists should never believe their theories are true. The most they should ever do is to accept them as empirically adequate. That's why he's an instrumentalist. So that is his view about science. Now, what would it be like to appropriate von Frassen's general approach not to science, but to religion? Is there any position analogous to constructive empiricism on the religious side that I might be able to use to deal with the tension problem of contradictions between science and religion? Well, I think maybe there is. What would it be to take this sort of attitude towards a religious text and a religious tradition? First of all, it would be to give the religious text a literal semantics. You would construe it not metaphorically, but literally. If the text said, God divided the Red Sea, it means God divided the Red Sea. Just as if the theory says there are electrons with certain properties, that's what the theory means. Secondly, you have the idea of immersion. That is, for certain purposes, you enter very actively into the world of that text. In the case of the scientist, it's for doing your research. In the case of religion, it would be for your religious life. It would be for your religious observance. It would be for how you think about the world and your place in it. But immersion is not the same as belief. You would immerse yourself into that religious world, but you would not believe everything that the religious text says. Rather, you would accept that religious tradition and that religious text, which would mean you believe some of its claims, but not all of them. And just how that would work is quite complicated, and I'm not going to go into it because I want to make sure that we have some time for discussion. But notice how this gives you away, this distinction between belief and acceptance gives you a way, or gives me a way, of having my cake and eating it too. Because it enables me to hold on to the full content of the religious texts in my tradition. I construe them literally. It enables me to hold on to the full content of the scientific theories that I want to subscribe to, even though there may be contradictions between those claims. I can be consistent in my belief, because although the texts I am working with are contradictory, my beliefs can be consistent, because I do not fully believe the content of, in my case, the religious text, but in the case of people like von Frassen, the scientific text. So the set of my beliefs will be consistent, even though the set of statements that I live with and use may not be. So let me put this view in a rather pejorative way, since I said that used that nasty expression, pick and mix, for the wonderful Plantinga's view. Isn't this like treating the Bible as a novel? I mean, aren't novels a very good example of exactly what I'm talking about? Nobody, just to make this clear, I'm talking about cheap novels, right? Nobody worries about the fact that sometimes in some novels, claims are made that contradict things you believe. You know that that didn't happen. That doesn't upset anyone. Nor does it lead people to say, oh, well, this is a contradiction, so we must construe the novel metaphorically. It isn't really claiming that the Gherkin was in London, that incredible building was on fire last year, right? Because we know that wasn't true. No, when you read a novel, you do give it a literal semantics. You understand it literally. When you're reading the novel, you immerse yourself I think in a rather superficial way, but you do immerse yourself in the world of that novel. And yet your beliefs are perfectly consistent, because you don't believe everything in the novel is true. So that is, at least superficially, quite similar to the proposal I'm making about religion. We construe the religious text perfectly literally. We immerse ourselves in it, but we don't fully believe everything it says, and so our beliefs are consistent with science. Well, I think to a first approximation, it is a good comparison. The difference for me is that the significance of a novel, even a great novel, for my life, is nothing like the significance of the religious texts of my tradition for my life. And of course, to go back to one of my caveats from before, I don't just read the religious texts in my tradition. I am active around those texts, obviously in ritual activity and in lots of other ways as well. So I think the novel is a useful comparison, but I don't think it shows that my attitude towards religion is demeaning. Rather, I immerse myself in a religious tradition. I treat the text with much more respect, I think, than someone who would take a metaphorical interpretation or a pick and mix interpretation. But I manage to hold on by the skin of my teeth to consistent beliefs. So that's the distinction I've been working through this lecture, the distinction between revising content and revising belief when there's a tension in a set of statements. In this case, a tension between religious statements and scientific statements. I am advertising the option of holding on to content and instead revising belief, an attitude of literalism without fundamentalism. So you're construing the religious text literally, but you're not a fundamentalist about it from the point of view of belief. It is advocating a kind of inconsistency in content without irrationality. You work with the text in an unexpurgated form, unboulderized, unmangled, but you don't believe everything you read. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you very much, Peter. Well, I think that's given us lots to chew on and think about. So who wants to kick off the questions? So, yes.
Many thanks, Peter.
Sure.
I think the use of the philosophy of science is illuminating, but I wonder if it doesn't illuminate what's going to be a central problem both for those who are believers, and I use the term advisedly, and
Sure.
those who are non-believers, because it looks to me that the risk is that we're being offered a sort of methadone substitute that is actually already taking us off the real drug, because the real drug of religion is belief, that in fact belief is so central to it, and it's got to be wholehearted, and the commitment arises from that prior apprehension that this is fundamentally important and true, that what you've actually offered is a sort of route out of the world of belief as perceived through the eyes of religious believers. The world has unfortunately changed for us, to use your Kuhnian analogy, and we're no longer seeing this text as the thing that focuses and grounds our apprehension of reality. So I'm not sure if my holding forth is making you see what the question is.
Absolutely. No, you're very clear about the question.
What I'm raving about.
No,
but
it's
I think Richard Dawkins, for example, would say this is neither truly faithful nor truly reasonable. And I can understand how all sorts of people would want a methadone route out of religion, that they've been brought up in religion or they're committed to religion, and then they find, oh dear, the facts are otherwise, and so they look for some human coping strategy, and this looks to be as sophisticated and illuminating one as many of the others that you've outlined. But unfortunately, that's what it is. You've taken us off the real drug. You've sold the pass and the farm and all the other methods.
Yeah, well, some of that and others, but I think it is the obvious worry that some people will have in my proposal. And it's absolutely right. What I'm suggesting does not involve belief in the entire religious text literally construed. It is not a form of fundamentalism. And for some people that is intolerable, because that's what they think religion is all about. I do see religion as a human activity of enormous value. So it's a question, I guess, in the end, of what you can live with. I don't see it as methadone. I see it as, well, one way of looking at it is think of the value, the non-supernatural, naturalistic values of religion that we could all agree about. That whatever your religious commitment, you think that there are practical human values to that religious commitment. I can have all of those. What I can't have is the supernatural values. So for example, if for you, religion, for example, has no value unless it underwrites an active afterlife, then my approach is not giving that to you. So I think that's absolutely right. And I think this is connected to what I said at the very beginning of my presentation about my own perspective on this issue. That is, I think to some extent this may be connected to a contrast between a typical Jewish attitude towards religion and a typical Christian attitude towards religion. That is, I think in Christianity nowadays, there is much more of an emphasis on faith and belief than there is in Judaism. Nowadays, actually, perhaps than there's ever been in Judaism. In Judaism, the first thing about religion is not what do you believe. The first thing about religion is what do you do. Whereas in Christianity, my impression anyway, is that for many people the first thing is what do you believe. I'm not convinced that that was always the case in Christianity. I think that if you go in the history of Christianity, what you may find is that it used to be much closer to Judaism in this respect than it now is. But that's absolutely right. Of course, that's the great thing about my talk. I gave you a huge menu of options. And in this case in particular, you could, instead of going through the kind of this activity that I went through to try and apply von Frassen's constructive empiricism over to the religious bit so we don't have to believe all the religious stuff but we can have the full text, you could be a fundamentalist on the religious side and take a strongly instrumentalist view of science. And that would also be a way of maintaining full content on both sides, but perhaps finding a way of consistent belief.
Yes.
2 points really. One, I've been reading Robert Winston recently.
Yes.
He talks about Judaism as taking a belief or Torah or whatever and looking for logical or apparent errors in a chain of reasoning. He said the Jewish faith is often very questioning of that. I wonder if that's part of what you're saying. And secondly, going back a few years, showing my age, Malcolm Jeeves talks about complementarity, so that psychology and neurophysiology give different but complementary definitions of descriptions of the real world. The argument is therefore that religion and science are complementary but different levels of description of the real world.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for both of those comments. On the second one, I'll just say that there may be some affinity there with the Kuhnian material that I discussed, the kind of many world thing. That may correspond to many levels. So that's one possibility. But I want to say something specifically about your first point, which I think is absolutely right. I mean, this emphasis in the Jewish tradition on worrying the problem, on analysis and dispute. You know, the saying is, 2 Jews, 3 views. And I think there's something to that. And I think that is important, and that shows how much work I'll have to do to modify von Frassen's view in order to apply it to religion. Because what von Frassen wants to say is when you have a sufficiently well-tested scientific theory, you just trust its predictions. It becomes an authority, not for its highly theoretical claims, but for the observable predictions you can derive from it. When it comes to my relationship with Torah, what I want to say is that it does not have that kind of authoritative status. It is rather a text to argue with. And that includes in its moral aspects, right? There are ethical aspects of the Torah that I reject. But I find that struggling with that text is a particularly good way for me to get clearer about my own stance. So I appreciate that more.
Yes.
What I found particularly fascinating about this was the way that in this discussion it illuminates the fact that the problem has always existed and certainly always been recognized, certainly within Judaism. I was reading something the other day about the way that people found it difficult to understand the prophet Ezekiel, and should this be regarded as part of Scripture? Not because of the fanciful imagery, but was this actually really consistent with the Torah, and was the law that is being proclaimed by Ezekiel consistent with what you find in other parts of the Scriptures? And the rabbi who retires to his attic with 300 bottles of oil, and until he's consumed this lot, he's not going to get to the bottom of the problem. You know, if we take this sort of attitude, that it always has been difficult to recognize religious belief with not just whatever, but with life, which was what reconciling the Torah was about, then the problems that we have with our current thing, particularly focused on science and religion, come into a much better perspective, because it's something that we've always got to address ourselves to, and we've always got to say, what does our religious faith have to say to the world we find ourselves in today, which might be, from what you said, is a different world from the world of Descartes, the world of somebody in the past, and so on and so forth. It might be a different world, and how do we frame our discussion in ways that are going to be comprehensible today? So I found that very illuminating.
Well, thank you. I mean, let me just pick up on one point you've made, and that is the problem. I've emphasized the tension problem between science and religion, but it's also important to think about ways of managing the tension problem between different religions perhaps, but even within a single religious tradition. And that, I think, is what you're flagging. Within the Jewish tradition, there are inconsistencies, at least apparently, between the Jewish texts. And this approach also gives one a way of dealing with that, and this connects with the grappling issue. It's a little bit like the way scientists use inconsistent models in the same area of science. It gives you that flexibility to deal with that.
Yeah.
For clarity, what would be your view on the Christian claim of the resurrection? In the sense of, would you sort of take Hume's view that it couldn't possibly take place? Or would you just say the evidence isn't in, or there just isn't enough for me to be able to take it seriously?
Yeah, I mean, Hume, first of all, I do not read Hume quite that way. I don't think Hume says it could not have taken place. I think Hume's claim is epistemic. Hume's slogan was, don't believe in a miracle on the basis of testimony, unless the falsity of the testimony would require a greater miracle. What he's saying is it'll always be more likely that there was some confusion in the testimony than that the miracle took place, because a miracle for Hume is, by definition, a maximally unlikely event. And he thinks you should always weigh your belief according to the evidence. But anyway, that's kind of by the by. I'm afraid my own view about the resurrection is, not that I've studied it closely, but that it seems to me that the balance of evidence we have does not support the view that it actually took place. I think, given what we know about the way the world works, that's not likely to have taken place.
Yes, I would just ask this question, but could I make a tiny little plea before it to the audience that, as another Jew, that believe me, there are fundamentalist Jews around. Maybe you don't mix with them, but there are plenty of fundamentalist Jews around. But apart from that, are you offering philosophy, or are you offering history, or are you offering what I think you're offering, which is therapy?
Well, I'm not sure those are mutually exclusive. I'm certainly not offering serious history in this talk. It's mostly philosophy, but as I indicated at the very beginning of my talk, this is not a purely intellectual problem for me. So in that sense, I am offering philosophy partially in the service of therapy.
You see, as a practicing psychiatrist for most of my professional life, I constantly had to deal with people who have conflicts of belief, irreconcilable beliefs. You know, she's the most wonderful girl in the world, and she's causing me absolute grief, that sort of thing, and other things. You know, and he's a wonderful son, and he's an absolute bastard to his mother. What can I do? And it seems to me therapists can deal with this by giving strategies, but I would say they are always philosophically untrue. And dare I say it, and I loved your talk, and I think you're a wonderful guy, but this was therapy, and for me, it wasn't kosher philosophy.
And why? Can you say in a nutshell what you found least satisfying?
Well, because philosophy would not simply allow you to say, we will just not focus on the bit that's irreconcilable. On the contrary, a philosopher should be focusing primarily on what's irreconcilable. It's the therapist who focuses on the other bits and steers away from the irreconcilable.
Yeah, I'm sorry that you took my message in that way. I was not suggesting that we don't focus on the bit that's irreconcilable. Rather, I was suggesting that there are more things you can do with statements than simply believe them. And that not believing them doesn't mean not focusing on them. That, in a way, was my main message.
Okay.
Yes, Wang Yang.
your idea of preserving the content assumes that interpreting the scripture literally is always the correct way. But I'm not sure if this assumption is always correct, because if an author or speaker purposely use metaphorical means, then can we say that if we take it literally, we are preserving the content? If the author has the intention of using metaphorical language, or taking it literally will actually change the content rather than preserve it?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I did acknowledge it, though very speedily, near the beginning of my talk, where I said that my view is not that the book of Exodus contains no metaphor. I said it's clear to me that it does contain metaphor, right? I gave the example of the mighty arm that God used. So I absolutely agree with you. There is going to be metaphor in the text. And your question raises the very difficult issue of how you decide which bits of the text should be construed literally and which bits should be construed metaphorically. And I guess a take-home message you could take from my talk on that subject is that I've given you no direct guidance on how one might do that. It's a very difficult problem. But I have given a kind of warning. I've suggested don't make that demarcation. Don't decide what to construe metaphorically and what to construe literally simply for your own epistemic convenience. That is, don't decide whenever there's some tension between what the text seems to be saying and what you see as very good science. Oh, that must have been simply metaphorical. I think that's a mistake. I think it could well be literal, even where it conflicts with science.
Yeah, of course, but if we don't take it, we don't take our own attitude very seriously, but we take, let's say, the opinions of the biblical scholars seriously, then we'll see that some of the conclusions of their research is that, for example, the book of Genesis contains a lot of poetic genre. So that will warrant us taking it more literally.
That's a different sort of grounds for doing it. I agree, though. That would make sense.
Okay, well, I think there'll be a lot more questions. We have come to 2. We didn't stop sharp on 2, and I think we've had a great discussion, and I know there's a lot more discussion on this to come. And I don't know if Peter can stay around a little bit just for people who haven't had a chance to get their questions out. So thank you, Peter, again. Very, very stimulating talking to you. Thank you very much.